In the late 18th century, France, a nation once defined by its ancient grandeur and absolute monarchy, teetered on the edge of a total collapse. Below the gilded halls of Versailles, different story unfolded, one of deep hunger, rising injustice, and a spirit ready to ignite. Whispers of liberty and equality began to echo through the dark Parisian streets. The common man, burdened by taxes and starving while the rich feasted, finally found his voice. This was not a simple riot. It was a societal earthquake destined to shake the foundations of the world. The year is 1793. The king has fallen, and the guillotine stands as a brutal monument to a new form of justice. Fear and suspicion gripped the city of Paris, turning it into a crucible of radical change, where every shadow hides a spy, and every single whisper is a plot. From the grand boulevards to the narrowest alleys, the revolution devours its own children. In this time of chaos, loyalty and treachery blur together as the new republic is forged in fire. This is the dark story of 1793, the year Paris became the streets of terror. By early 1793, the euphoria of the early revolution had dissolved, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. The execution of King Louis XVI in January sent shockwaves across Europe, isolating France from its monarchical neighbors and plunging the nation deeper into an ideological war. The act, meant to solidify the republic, instead polarized the country and galvanized its external enemies. Inside Paris, the radical Jacobin faction gained dominance, setting the stage for political purges. A relentless wind swept through the cold streets of Paris. Citizens, now forced to declare their loyalties, moved with caution. The vibrant revolutionary fervor was giving way to an atmosphere of deep suspicion, as the watchful eyes of the state seemed to be everywhere, searching for dissent. The Committee of Public Safety, a body formed in April 1793, rapidly became the ultimate authority in France. Led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, it wielded unprecedented power, ostensibly to protect the Republic from its internal and external enemies. However, its true legacy would be the systematic suppression of opposition through fear. Every decision was viewed through the lens of revolutionary purity, turning neighbors into informants and accelerating the cycle of paranoia. The trial of Marie Antoinette in October 1793 was less about justice and more about spectacle. Stripped of her regal titles, she was presented as a symbol of the old regime's decadence and treason. The public proceedings were a stark demonstration of the new republic's power to dismantle the symbols of monarchy. Her conviction and subsequent execution further cemented the break from the past, echoing the fate of her husband and marking a definitive end to royal rule in France. A bustling city square in 1793 Paris. Citizens in revolutionary attire, some wearing tricolor cockades, gather around a public notice board. The camera captures their intense, serious expressions as they read the latest decrees, while shadows of the rising terror loom over their everyday lives. The Vendéan Revolt, a massive counter-revolutionary insurgency in western France, erupted into open civil war. Royalists and devout Catholics, outraged by the revolution's anti-clerical policies and the execution of the king, took up arms against the Republic. This bloody conflict pitted Frenchman against Frenchman, transforming tranquil rural landscapes into battlefields. The brutality on both sides was immense, with massacres marking the grim struggle for control of the nation's future. In the streets of Paris, a chilling new phrase entered the lexicon: suspects. Anyone who could not prove their revolutionary zeal was liable to arrest. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, broadened the definition of who could be considered an enemy of the state to an alarming degree. Lawyers, former nobles, and even ordinary citizens expressing mild criticism found themselves ensnared in its net. This legal framework of fear transformed daily life into a trap for the unwary. A lone Revolutionary Guard, in a dark uniform and bicorn hat, stands watch over a misty Parisian bridge at dawn. His silhouette is sharp against the hazy sky. The scene conveys isolation and an ever-present, silent authority. This was the watchful eye of a regime that never slept or forgave. The Lève en masse was a total conscription of the French population, transforming the nation into a war machine. Every able-bodied man was to report for military service, while women and the elderly supported the war effort through manufacturing and nursing. This mobilization created the largest army Europe had ever seen. Fueled by fierce nationalism, it was a testament to the Republic's struggle for survival, but it also pulled men from farms and factories, cementing total war. Economic hardship continued to plague the common people despite the radical changes. The assignats, the revolutionary currency, depreciated rapidly, leading to rampant inflation and food shortages. Price controls were implemented, but they often led to black markets and further scarcity. Women, responsible for feeding their families, were often at the forefront of angry protests over the cost of bread. The promise of economic stability remained elusive, contributing to the tension. A close-up, dramatic shot of an old, tattered French tricolor flag, waving violently in a strong wind against a dark, cloudy sky. Rain begins to fall, making the fabric appear heavier and darker. This was the battered symbol of a nation in turmoil, struggling to hold its ground against the storm. As the year 1793 drew to a close, the Reign of Terror was fully underway. The Republic had survived its initial crises, but at a terrible cost. The guillotine, once a symbol of liberation, had become an instrument of political purification, removing anyone deemed an enemy of the state. The streets of Paris, though outwardly defiant, were thick with an invisible dread, a silent understanding that no one was truly safe as revolutionary fervor curdled into state-sponsored paranoia. The Conciergerie, a medieval palace-turned-prison on the banks of the Seine, became the grim antechamber to the guillotine. Known as the antechamber of death, its cold, damp cells were packed with hundreds of prisoners from every social class. Former aristocrats and simple shopkeepers sat together on rotting straw, waiting for their names to be called. The atmosphere was one of refined despair, where the sound of the tumbrel carts echoed outside the heavy stone walls of the prison. A heavy iron key turned slowly in a massive, rusted lock. The thick wooden door of a cell creaks open, revealing a sliver of dim, flickering light from a hallway. A thin layer of dust dances in the air as the heavy door reveals the dark, damp stone interior of the prison where hope goes to die. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established to try enemies of the people, was a mockery of judicial process. Presided over by the ruthless Fouquier Tinville, the court increasingly dispensed with witnesses and defense counsel. Trials that once took days were reduced to mere minutes. The verdict was almost always the same: death. For those standing in the prisoner's dock, the hall was not a place of law, but a theater of political execution where the script was already written by the state. A close-up shot of a judge's wooden gavel striking a stone table in slow motion. Dust rises from the impact. In the background, the blurred figures of a shouting crowd can be seen through the dim, smoky air of the courtroom. The gavel strike is the final echo of a life about to be extinguished. In the streets, the tricoteuses became a terrifying fixture of the landscape. These women sat at the foot of the guillotine, knitting calmly while heads fell and sentences were passed. Their presence turned public executions into a domestic event, stripping the act of its solemnity. They represented the radicalized base of the revolution, a segment of the populace that had become desensitized to violence. To many, their rhythmic needles were as cold and relentless as the machine itself. The tumbrels, the open wooden carts used to transport prisoners, became the most hated sight in Paris. Every afternoon, these carts wound their way through the streets, carrying the day's batch to the scaffold. Spectators lined the route, some jeering and others watching in petrified silence. This slow procession was a deliberate part of the terror, a public shaming designed to remind every citizen of the state's reach. The clatter of the wheels was a drumbeat of the Republic's power. A low-angle, slow-motion shot of wooden cartwheels rolling over rough cobblestones. Mud and gray water splash from the puddles as the wheels turn. The camera follows the movement closely, capturing the heavy, rhythmic vibration of the tumbrel moving towards its final and inevitable destination. Maximilien Robespierre lived a life of austere simplicity that contrasted with the chaos he directed. In his rented room, he spent his nights drafting the speeches that would send hundreds to their deaths. He He believed that terror was nothing more than justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. For Robespierre, the blood being shed was a necessary purge to create a republic of virtue. This terrifying idealism made him immune to pity, seeing himself as the personification of the general will. The daily list of the executed, printed on cheap broadsheets, was read with trembling hands in every calf. People scanned the names, looking for friends or business associates. To be mentioned was to be erased from society. This paper trail of death served as a constant reminder that the revolution had no mercy. The ink was barely dry before the next list was being prepared. This bureaucratization of death made the terror feel mathematical, a system where life was a variable to delete. A candle burns low on a wooden desk covered in official documents with red wax seals. A hand holding a quill pen enters the frame and crosses out a name on a long list. The ink is dark and heavy. Shadows dance on the wall behind the desk as the candle flickers out in the cold Parisian night. The Luxembourg prison held a different kind of horror, as it housed those who were once the architects of the revolution itself. Danton and other heroes of 1789 now found themselves behind the same bars they had once built for others. The revolution was indeed devouring its own. In these halls, the debates about liberty continued, but they were now the desperate arguments of men who knew the blade was waiting. The very tongues that ignited the masses were now being silenced by the machine. A slow-motion shot of a prisoner's hand reaching through iron bars to catch a glimpse of the pale sunlight. The skin is pale, and the fingers tremble slightly. The cold stone of the prison wall is textured with dampness and moss. The sunlight is weak and gray, a final mercy for the condemned. In late 1793, the revolution targeted the soul of France. Dechristianization sought to dismantle centuries of Catholic influence, replacing it with the cult of reason. Notre Dame was rededicated as a temple of reason. Altars were destroyed, and the icons of saints were replaced by busts of revolutionary martyrs like Marat. This was a radical attempt to reboot the human mind. For the deeply religious rural populations, this was a violent assault on their eternal salvation. A group of revolutionary soldiers in tattered blue uniforms smashing a stone cross in a village square. The stone shatters in slow motion, sending dust into the air. The lighting is cold and overcast, emphasizing the raw and clinical violence of this cultural eradication in the heart of France. The revolutionary calendar was perhaps the most ambitious attempt to erase history. Time itself was restructured. The year was divided into 12 months named after nature, and the 7-day week was replaced by a 10-day decade. Sunday was abolished. This was a psychological war against the biological rhythms of the people. By removing traditional holidays, the Republic aimed to make the state the only clock by which a citizen lived. Every tick belonged entirely to the Republic. The Festival of Reason at Notre Dame was a surreal spectacle. A young actress, as the goddess of liberty, was carried through the aisles. For the architects of the terror, this was the triumph of intellect over superstition. But for many watching, it felt like an empty ritual. The grandeur of the old faith had been replaced by a manufactured ceremony. This cultural void created a sense of alienation, as people lived in a world where their traditional comfort had been outlawed. A close-up shot of a heavy, leather-bound Bible being thrown onto a growing bonfire in a misty street. The pages curl and turn to ash in slow motion. The orange glow of the fire reflects on the wet cobblestones and the cold leather boots of the surrounding Revolutionary Guards. Paranoia reached into the very names people carry. Names of saints were banned, and cities were renamed. Even the way people addressed each other changed. Monsieur was replaced by citoyen. Failure to use the correct terminology was a sign of being a suspect. Daily life became a linguistic minefield where a single slip of the tongue could lead to interrogation. This total control of language ensured that even in private moments, the presence of the state was felt by everyone. A revolutionary official's hand dipping a quill into red ink and aggressively crossing out the word saint from a local map. The ink bleeds into the parchment in slow motion. The room is dimly lit by a single candle that casts long, shaky shadows against the stone walls of the office. In the rural provinces, the suppression of the church led to secret, underground masses. Priests who refused to take the oath became hunted men, hiding in barns to perform baptisms by candlelight. For these communities, the revolution had become a demonic force. The clash between the secular vision of Paris and the traditional heart of the countryside was irreconcilable. This spiritual divide fueled the civil war in the Vendée, turning it into a holy crusade for the rebels. The cult of the supreme being was Robespierre's personal attempt to find a middle ground. In June 1794, he led a massive procession in Paris, envisioned as a rational religion to provide a moral foundation. However, his colleagues in the convention watched with growing resentment, seeing him as a self-appointed high priest. This public display of ego marked the beginning of his isolation. Politicians were terrified by the man who now claimed to speak for the creator himself. A sweeping shot of a massive crowd in 18th century Paris, all looking up at a high wooden platform. Robespierre's silhouette is visible against a hazy sky as he raises a torch. The camera moves slowly, capturing the diverse, anxious faces of the citizens trapped in his new world. Close-up of a new revolutionary clock with 10 hours instead of 12. The single hand ticks forward with the heavy, mechanical sound in slow motion. The metal face is cold and engraved with symbols. Shadows pass over the clock like the hands of fate ticking toward a final reckoning. By the end of this purge, France was a nation unmoored. Old anchors were gone, replaced by a state that demanded everything but offered only fear. The streets of terror were silent, not out of peace, but exhaustion. The attempt to build utopia through destruction created a landscape of ruins, where the goddess of reason looked down on a population starving and suspicious. The revolution dismantled the old world, but a nation cannot live on ideology and blood alone. In the summer of 1794, the terror accelerated into a frantic phase known as the Great Terror. The Law of 22 Prairial removed the last protections for the accused, making witnesses and defense counsel irrelevant. Now, the Revolutionary Tribunal had only two options: acquittal or death. In Paris, the pace of execution skyrocketed, with hundreds losing their lives every single week. Justice had become an industrial assembly line fueled by state-sponsored death. A close-up of the guillotine blade rising slowly up its wooden track, creaking against the metal. Sunlight glints off the sharp steel as it reaches the top. The movement is mechanical, cold, and unstoppable, symbolizing the relentless efficiency of the Republic's final and terrible answer. Robespierre, increasingly isolated, made a fatal mistake in July. In a fiery speech, he announced a new list of traitors within the government, but refused to reveal their names. For the deputies, who lived in constant terror of being next, this was the breaking point. If everyone was a traitor in the mind of the incorruptible, then no one was safe. The fear Robespierre used to control the assembly suddenly united his enemies in a desperate alliance for their own survival. Politicians in the National Convention shouting and pointing fingers at each other in slow motion. The atmosphere is pure chaos and desperation. Papers fly through the air, and shadows of raised arms project on stone walls, creating a scene of intense and final political conflict. On the 9th of Thermidor, the convention finally exploded. When Robespierre tried to speak, he was silenced by shouts of "Down with the tyrant." For the first time, the man who dominated France through words lost his voice. Declared an outlaw, he and his followers fled to the Hôtel de Ville. The tension in Paris was palpable. The streets were deserted as the fate of the revolution was decided in a struggle between the remnants of the terror and those who could no longer bear it. The capture of Robespierre was chaotic and bloody. During the storming of the Hôtel de Ville, a shot rang out, shattering the jaw of the incorruptible. He was found bloodied and mute, stretched across the very table where he once signed death warrants. This fall symbolized the ruin of his moral authority. The man who preached absolute virtue was now reduced to a pathetic figure, wrapped in soiled bandages and mocked by those who once feared him. The irony of history was complete. Revolutionary soldiers smashing through a heavy wooden door with musket butts. Wood splinters in slow motion and dust fills the air. Through the broken door, the glow of lanterns and gunpowder smoke is visible in a dark hallway. The pace is frantic, claustrophobic, and final. On the morning of July 28th, Robespierre was taken to the guillotine in the same cart he sent so many others. The crowd, which once cheered him, now roared with joy at his fall. At the scaffold, the executioner ripped the bandages from his wounded face, causing a scream of agony that echoed through the square. The blade that fell on Robespierre's neck did not just cut a life, it closed the darkest chapter of the revolution, leaving behind an exhausted nation. The Thermidorian reaction followed, a violent purge of the architects of terror. Jacobins were hunted down, and busts of Marat were thrown into the sewers. The political pendulum swung violently as France tried to distance itself from the blood spill. Prisons were opened, and survivors emerged to tell their stories. However, the trauma of 1793 would remain on the country's soul. Liberty had been won, but at a price that many now wondered if it had been worth paying. A massive crowd in a Paris square throwing hats into the air and embracing. The sun shines brightly through the clouds. The camera pulls back to reveal the guillotine in the background, now still and empty under the clear daylight. The movement shows a profound collective relief. Close-up of a hand dropping a red Phrygian cap into the mud. Rain begins to fall, and water slowly washes the dried blood from the fabric. The camera focuses on the texture of the cloth and water running over the street stones. Atmosphere of melancholy and a finished cycle of blood. In the aftermath, France searched for a new direction. The Directory took power, but instability continued to haunt the Republic. The void left by Robespierre's fall and the chaos of warring factions prepared the ground for a new kind of leader. In the shadows, a young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte began to rise. The revolution, which started with the dream of democracy, was about to hand its destiny to an emperor. The scars of 1793 would never fully vanish. The French Revolution of 1793 remains one of history's most profound warnings. What began as a noble quest for universal human rights devolved into a mechanical slaughterhouse, proving that even the most righteous ideals can be corrupted by the hunger for total control. The streets of terror were not just a physical location, but a psychological state. Today, the echoes of the falling blades still resonate through our modern understanding of political radicalism. A slow, sweeping shot of a modern Parisian street, transitioning into a faded, historical overlay of the same location in 1793. The camera moves through the phantom silhouettes of revolutionary guards and citizens, bridging the gap between the past and the present in a single motion. The ultimate irony was the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1799, a nation exhausted by trauma was ready to trade liberty for the promise of order. The same people who cheered the fall of the king cheered the coronation of an emperor. Napoleon offered a synthesis of revolutionary laws and monarchical authority. The streets of terror were paved over by the grand monuments of an empire, yet the struggle between order and freedom remained the defining French struggle. Historians still debate the necessity of the terror. Whether a desperate measure or an inevitable outcome, the human cost remains undeniable. Thousands of lives, from queen to peasant, were extinguished in pursuit of a perfection that could never exist. These victims were the fuel for a fire that almost consumed France. To remember the streets of terror is to honor the fragile nature of civilization and the terrible speed with which a neighbor can become a stranger. A close-up of a pair of weathered hands closing a massive, leather-bound historical ledger. Dust motes float in the air as the heavy cover meets the pages with a dull thud. The scene is lit by a soft light from a library window, symbolizing the final transition of history into memory. The legal legacy of 1793 was not entirely blood and ash. The radical debates gave birth to the Napoleonic Code, which preserved the revolutionary principle of equality before the law. This framework would go on to influence legal systems across the entire globe. Even in its darkest hour, the revolution planted seeds of progress that would bloom after the blood was washed away. The paradox of the terror is that it was both a tragedy of human rights and a catalyst for their codification. Place de la Concorde stands as a silent witness to the carnage. Today, tourists walk where the tumbrils once rolled, largely unaware of the desperate screams that once filled the air. The name Concorde, meaning harmony, was a choice to heal the wounds. Yet, beneath the grand obelisk, the memory of 1793 lingers. It is a place of historical scars. Paris remains a living museum, where the grandeur of the Enlightenment and the brutality of the Revolution are forever entwined. A slow-motion tracking shot of a white bird flying low over the Seine River. The water is calm and reflects the pale morning sky. The stone architecture of the bridges is visible in the background. The radicalism of the Jacobins left a permanent mark on the global political landscape. Their attempt to rebuild society inspired future movements, for better and worse. The concept of state terror as a tool for social engineering was a dark innovation of 1793. The revolution taught the world that a mob can be more powerful than an army, and a single idea more dangerous than cannons. The power to create a new world often comes with an irresistible urge to destroy the old one. A panoramic pull-out shot of the Paris skyline at night. The modern city lights are bright and vibrant. Slowly, the Eiffel Tower and other landmarks begin to flicker and dissolve into a dark, candlelit silhouette of the 18th century city, leaving only a single, distant lantern glowing. Close-up of a drop of ink falling into a basin of clear water. The ink clouds and swirls in slow motion, turning the water a dark, murky gray. This movement symbolizes how the events of the terror permanently stained the clear and noble ideals of the early revolution for centuries to come. As we walk the streets of terror today, we walk through the wreckage of a dream. The French Revolution remains a testament to the heights of human aspiration and the depths of human cruelty. 1793 was the year the world learned that liberty is not a gift, but a fragile responsibility. As the smoke of the guillotine clears, we are left with the image of a people who dared to demand a better world, only to find themselves lost in the darkness of their own making. Inside the prison walls, the fear was almost tangible. Every turn of a key, every footsteps in the hallway, brought a cold sweat to the prisoners. They were trapped in a legal vacuum where innocence was no defense against the hungry blade of the state's new machinery of death. The courtrooms were no longer places of justice, but arenas of mob rule. The shouting crowd, fueled by years of resentment and new propaganda, demanded blood as a sacrifice to the Republic. The judges, fearful of being seen as weak, complied with the mob's desires, turning legal proceedings into a deadly theater where the outcome was decided long before the first word was spoken. The blade fell with a mechanical and cold finality. In that brief moment, the dreams of individuals were extinguished to serve the collective ideology of a nation in turmoil. The sound of the machine became the heartbeat of a new and terrifying era of governance. At night, Paris became a city of shadows and fires. The smoke from the city's hearths and burning documents hung heavy in the air, mixing with the damp mist of the Seine. Every street corner felt like a potential trap, and every flickering light in a window could be a sign of a conspiracy or an arrest about to happen. The city, once the beacon of enlightenment, was now a labyrinth of fear. The tricolor flag, once the vibrant symbol of liberty, equality, and fraternity, now hung tattered and stained by the very violence it had inspired. It waved in the cold wind of 1793, a silent witness to the internal rot of a revolution that had forgotten its original purpose. Inside private homes, conversations were whispered in the dark. Families lived in constant dread, knowing that a single misplaced word could lead to a visit from the committee. The walls seemed to have ears, and the fear of being denounced by a neighbor or even a relative made every relationship a potential danger. The trust that holds a society together was being methodically dismantled. The judges pronounced their sentences with a chilling indifference. They had become cogs in a machine of state power, where the lives of individuals were merely numbers to be processed. Their cold eyes reflected the total lack of empathy that had become the hallmark of the new justice. As the curtain falls on 1793, the guillotine stands alone in the dark, a silent guardian of the Republic's terrible secrets. The streets are empty, the fires have burned low, and the city waits in a petrified silence for the next dawn. The streets of terror have claimed their place in history, a stark and eternal warning of what happens when a nation loses its soul to the pursuit of power.